What if I told you that stupidity isn't just the absence of intelligence, but something far more insidious? Picture this. A renowned scientist with multiple degrees suddenly starts believing and spreading dangerous misinformation. A compassionate teacher begins endorsing harmful ideologies. A loving parent starts making decisions that endanger their own children. These aren't evil people. They're intelligent, well-meaning individuals just like the people in your life, maybe even like you. But here's what no one wants you to understand. The greatest threat to civilization isn't evil people doing evil things. It's ordinary people who've simply stopped thinking. And according to a theory developed by a man who watched Nazi Germany transform his entire society, this isn't happening to other people. It's happening right now, to people just like you and me, and most of us don't even realize we're falling into the trap. Today we're exploring Bonhoeffer's terrifying theory of functional stupidity, how intelligent people become immune to reason, why our modern systems actively encourage intellectual surrender, and what happens when entire societies lose their capacity for independent thought. We'll uncover how this isn't just about intelligence or education, but about psychological and social forces that can transform anyone into what Bonhoeffer called puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why Bonhoeffer believed stupidity is more dangerous than evil, how modern technology has weaponized these psychological vulnerabilities in ways he never could have imagined, and most importantly, how to recognize when you're falling into this trap yourself. I've spent years studying the psychology of belief, social conformity, and the mechanisms that make intelligent people abandon critical thinking, and what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you evaluate your own beliefs and those of the people around you. But first, let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. Have you ever found yourself believing something simply because everyone around you believed it too? Keep that question in mind, because understanding Bonhoeffer's theory isn't just about historical insight, it's about recognizing the forces actively working on your mind right now. This isn't just philosophical speculation. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted his infamous obedience experiments at Yale University. Ordinary volunteers were instructed by an authority figure to administer what they believed were increasingly painful electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing screams of agony, 65% of participants delivered shocks they thought could be lethal. These weren't sadists or mentally ill individuals. They were normal people who had temporarily surrendered their capacity for independent moral judgment. This is exactly what Bonhoeffer witnessed firsthand in Nazi Germany, and it led him to develop one of the most unsettling theories about human nature ever conceived. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't your typical philosopher sitting in an ivory tower pondering abstract ideas. He was a man watching his entire civilization collapse from the inside. Born in 1906 into an intellectual German family, his father was a prominent psychiatrist and neurologist. Bonhoeffer had every reason to believe in the power of education and rational discourse. He was a brilliant theologian, a Lutheran pastor, and someone who moved in circles of Germany's most educated and cultured citizens. But as the Nazi Party rose to power, Bonhoeffer witnessed something that shattered his faith in human rationality. He watched as his fellow Germans, educated, cultured, religious people, began supporting policies and leaders that contradicted everything they claimed to believe. These weren't ignorant masses being manipulated by clever propaganda. These were professors, doctors, clergy members, and intellectuals who were actively participating in their own intellectual surrender. What made this so disturbing wasn't just that it was happening, but who it was happening to. These were people who should have known better. People with the tools of critical thinking, with access to information, with moral frameworks that should have protected them from such obvious manipulation. From his prison cell in 1943, waiting to be executed for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote what would become his most haunting observation. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. What made this observation so chilling wasn't just its context, but its precision. Evil, he noted, always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion. It creates unease, resistance, eventual breakdown. Evil people know they're doing wrong, which creates internal conflict and makes them vulnerable to being exposed and defeated. But stupidity, it believes it's doing good. making it absolutely immune to correction. People caught in functional stupidity aren't conflicted, they're confident. They aren't questioning themselves, they're certain they have all the answers. And this certainty makes them infinitely more dangerous than any malicious actor. Bonhoeffer realized he wasn't just witnessing political manipulation or propaganda success. He was observing a fundamental transformation in human consciousness, a surrender of the very capacity that makes us human, the ability to think independently and question authority. Perhaps Bonhoeffer's most prescient insight was about how stupidity serves existing power structures. Those in power don't need to actively suppress information anymore when they can create conditions where processing information honestly becomes prohibitively difficult. When people are overwhelmed, stressed, and bombarded with complexity, intellectual surrender becomes a survival strategy. Bonhoeffer discovered that stupidity isn't the absence of intelligence, it's the presence of intellectual surrender. And unlike evil, which contains the seeds of its own destruction, stupidity is immune to correction because it genuinely believes it's doing good. This makes it infinitely more dangerous than any malicious force. When Bonhoeffer used the word stupidity, he wasn't talking about low IQ or lack of education. He was describing something far more complex and terrifying. In his letters from prison, Bonhoeffer explained, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him." Here's what made Bonhoeffer's theory so revolutionary. He argued that stupidity often emerges not from individual failings, but from systemic pressures that make thinking independently both difficult and costly. He was describing what we now understand as functional stupidity, the surrender of critical thinking under pressure. The truth is, our economic systems actively incentivize intellectual shortcuts. Social media platforms make billions when users react emotionally rather than think critically. News outlets get more clicks with outrage than nuance. Politicians win elections with simple slogans rather than complex policy proposals. When people are working multiple jobs, drowning in debt, and constantly bombarded with information, intellectual surrender becomes what economists call rational ignorance. It becomes more efficient for individuals to remain uninformed about complex issues than to invest the time and energy required for genuine understanding. But here's the trap. This individual rationality creates collective irrationality, exactly the dynamic Bonhoeffer observed in Nazi Germany. Each person makes a personally rational choice to avoid the cognitive work of thinking independently, but the cumulative effect is a society that has lost its capacity for collective wisdom. Our brains, stressed and overwhelmed, are perfectly designed to comply with this pressure. When we're cognitively overloaded, we default to mental shortcuts called heuristics. We trust authority figures rather than evaluating evidence. We seek information that confirms what we already believe rather than challenging our assumptions. We follow social proof rather than independent analysis. Modern technology has weaponized these vulnerabilities in ways Bonhoeffer could never have imagined. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that make intellectual surrender easier than ever. A 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social platforms, not because people are stupid, but because false information often feels more emotionally satisfying than complex truths. When someone shares misinformation that confirms their worldview, they're participating in a system that rewards intellectual shortcuts over careful analysis. The algorithm feeds them more of the same, creating what acts like intellectual quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to show you exactly what you want to see? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of chosen ignorance in action, designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. We're not just dealing with human manipulation anymore. We're facing systems designed by artificial intelligence to exploit our mental shortcuts. The result isn't just individual choice, it's structural pressure toward intellectual surrender. And our brains, stressed and overwhelmed, are perfectly designed to comply. While economic systems push us toward intellectual shortcuts, our brains are actually wired to comply. And Bonhoeffer understood this decades before modern psychology confirmed it. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s showed exactly how this works psychologically. When people encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, their brains fight to reject it. But here's what Bonhoeffer understood that modern psychology has confirmed. This process is amplified when people are stressed, overwhelmed, or economically insecure, exactly the conditions our current systems create. Bonhoeffer observed that stupidity often emerges in group settings. He wrote, "It becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one." He noticed that perfectly rational individuals would abandon their critical thinking abilities when they became part of a large group or movement. This insight was decades ahead of its time. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s demonstrated exactly what Bonhoeffer had witnessed. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers, 75% of people will go along with the crowd at least once, even when they know the group is wrong. Now imagine how this plays out in our digital age. We're not just dealing with small groups in laboratory settings, we're dealing with massive online communities that can make anyone feel like they're part of a majority, even when they're part of a carefully curated echo chamber. The mechanism is exactly what Bonhoeffer described. When people feel threatened and uncertain, they become more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations that reduce complexity to simple narratives. But we're no longer just facing human authorities, we're facing algorithmic systems that know exactly which psychological buttons to push. We see this pattern play out repeatedly throughout history. The Salem witch trials weren't conducted by evil people, but by God-fearing community members who genuinely believed they were protecting their neighbours. The Red Scare of the 1950s wasn't driven by malicious actors, but by patriotic Americans who sincerely thought they were defending democracy. In each case, intelligent, educated people abandoned critical thinking in favour of group consensus and emotional certainty. They didn't set out to harm anyone. They were trying to do good, and that's exactly what made them so dangerous. We saw this play out in real time during COVID-19. Doctors, engineers, and lawyers, people with demonstrated analytical abilities, began sharing debunked theories about vaccines and treatments. These weren't failures of intelligence. They were failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented pressure. The scariest part? We're all vulnerable, no matter how smart we think we are. Our minds evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy, to trust familiar sources over unfamiliar ones, and to seek information that confirms what we already believe. These were survival features that helped our ancestors make quick decisions when hesitation meant death. But in our modern information environment, these same mental shortcuts that once saved us are now being weaponized against us. Every click, every pause, every emotional reaction is being analyzed and used to make us more predictable, more controllable, more willing to surrender our independent judgment. The tragedy is that intellectual surrender often feels like liberation. Thinking is hard work. It's uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It's painful to admit you might be wrong about something important, but Bonhoeffer argued that this discomfort is the price of remaining human. Here's perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all susceptible to functional stupidity, and the moment we think we're immune, we've already begun to succumb. Bonhoeffer observed something crucial about how stupidity operates. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers that you already know everything you need to know. It offers the comfort of certainty in an uncertain world. It promises simple answers to complex questions. This is why intelligent people are often the most vulnerable. They have the intellectual tools to rationalize almost anything. They can construct elaborate justifications for beliefs that feel good rather than beliefs that are true. Their intelligence becomes a weapon turned against itself. The Dunning-Kruger effect, identified by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, demonstrates this perfectly. People with limited knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their competence in that domain. But here's the twist that Bonhoeffer would have recognized. The more confident someone appears, the more likely others are to trust their judgment, even when that confidence is completely unwarranted. In our age of information abundance, this phenomenon has become epidemic. Anyone can find sources that support almost any position. Anyone can construct a worldview that feels internally consistent. Anyone can surround themselves with communities that reinforce their beliefs. The tools that should make us wiser have instead made it easier to become confidently wrong. Social media has created what researchers call false consensus, the illusion that your beliefs are more widely shared than they actually are. When your feed shows you dozens of people who agree with you, it's easy to assume that anyone who disagrees must be either ignorant or malicious. This isn't just confirmation bias, it's confirmation bias on steroids, powered by algorithms designed to keep you engaged rather than informed. The result is what philosophers call epistemic closure, entire communities that share not just beliefs, but standards of evidence, trusted sources, and ways of interpreting information. Once someone enters an epistemically closed system, it becomes almost impossible to reach them with contrary evidence because they've developed antibodies against information that challenges their worldview. Bonhoeffer saw this happening in Nazi Germany. People didn't just believe Nazi propaganda, they developed ways of thinking that made them immune to counterarguments. They had explanations for why contrary evidence was unreliable, why opposing voices were untrustworthy, why their certainty was justified even in the face of overwhelming contradictory information. But here's what makes our situation more dangerous than what Bonhoeffer witnessed. We're not just dealing with human propaganda anymore. We're dealing with artificial intelligence systems that can analyze our psychological profiles and deliver precisely the kind of information that will keep us locked in our epistemic bubbles. These systems know that people are more likely to share content that makes them angry than content that makes them think. They know that emotional reactions spread faster than careful analysis. They know that people will click on information that confirms their biases rather than information that challenges them. We've created a perfect storm: human psychology that's wired for intellectual shortcuts, economic systems that reward those shortcuts, and technological systems that exploit them with unprecedented precision. The result is a society where being confidently wrong has become more rewarding than being uncertainly right. Bonhoeffer paid the ultimate price for refusing to surrender his intellectual independence, and his final challenge to us is more urgent now than ever. On April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging. His last words, according to a fellow prisoner, were, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His sacrifice wasn't just about political resistance, it was about defending the very possibility of human thought. He understood that when people stop thinking independently, they stop being fully human. They become, in his words, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment. And in our current moment, those forces have become more sophisticated and more powerful than anything Bonhoeffer could have imagined. But here's what makes Bonhoeffer's final challenge so relevant today. Who stands fast? When the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when thinking independently requires courage, when the cost of truth is higher than the price of comfortable lies, who stands fast? The answer isn't found in superior intelligence or education. It's found in what Bonhoeffer called costly grace, the willingness to think independently even when it's painful, unpopular, or dangerous. But now we understand we're not just fighting social pressure, we're fighting millions of years of evolution and billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit our mental shortcuts. On an individual level, we can cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and potentially wrong. This means actively seeking out information that contradicts our beliefs, not to torture ourselves, but to test whether our beliefs are worth holding. Here are some concrete practices that can serve as daily resistance against intellectual surrender. First, practice intellectual friction. Set aside time each week to read thoughtful arguments from people who disagree with you, not to change your mind necessarily, but to test whether your convictions can withstand scrutiny. Second, embrace productive ignorance. When you find yourself absolutely certain about something, ask what evidence would change your mind. If you can't think of any, that's a red flag that you might be caught in functional stupidity. Third, slow down your sharing. Before posting anything online, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent source. That brief pause can break the algorithmic cycle that feeds on our emotional reactions. Finally, practice saying "I don't know" when you actually don't know something. In a world that rewards confident ignorance over humble uncertainty, admitting gaps in your knowledge becomes a radical act. But individual practices aren't enough. We also need structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier and more rewarding. This means requiring social media platforms to disclose their algorithmic biases and how they curate content. It means funding comprehensive public media literacy campaigns. It means designing online platforms that reward intellectual humility over tribal certainty. Most importantly, We need economic policies that reduce the stress and uncertainty that make people vulnerable to intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly worried about healthcare, housing, and employment, they have more mental bandwidth for careful thinking about complex issues. Bonhoeffer understood that the price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against our own tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult. In a world that profits from our intellectual surrender, choosing to think carefully and independently becomes one of the most important things we can do. If stupidity is partly chosen, it can also be rejected. If it's partly structural, structures can be changed. If it's the result of cognitive overwhelm, we can create conditions that make thinking easier rather than harder. Think of critical thinking like physical exercise. It's uncomfortable at first, but essential for strength. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without training, we can't expect to navigate complex information without practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought need regular use or they atrophy. Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity is unsettling precisely because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Intelligent people believing obviously false things, educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions, well-meaning citizens supporting policies that contradict their own values. The problem isn't that people are getting less intelligent, it's that our systems increasingly reward intellectual shortcuts over careful thinking. But within this sobering diagnosis lies genuine hope. We're not doomed to intellectual surrender. We can choose to resist the forces that want us to stop thinking. We can build systems that reward curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful analysis over quick reactions. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about something, the next time you catch yourself dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration, the next time you feel the comfort of having all the answers, remember Bonhoeffer's warning. That comfort might be the first sign that you're beginning to surrender your most human capacity. The question Bonhoeffer leaves us with isn't whether we're smart enough to avoid stupidity. It's whether we're committed enough to keep thinking when thinking becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, or costly. It's whether we have the courage to remain uncertain when certainty would be more comfortable. In our age of artificial intelligence and algorithmic manipulation, this choice has never been more important. We're facing systems designed to make thinking feel unnecessary, to make surrender feel like wisdom, to make intellectual shortcuts feel like efficiency. But every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful thinking over quick reactions, you're not just protecting your own mind. You're defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age of artificial stupidity. Here's my challenge to you. Find one belief you hold strongly and spend 30 minutes researching the best arguments against it. Not to torture yourself, not to become paralyzed by doubt, but to practice the kind of intellectual courage Bonhoeffer died defending. If your belief survives honest scrutiny, you'll hold it more confidently. If it doesn't, you'll have learned something valuable about the difference between conviction and truth. The future of human dignity might just depend on how we collectively answer Bonhoeffer's challenge. In a world designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, the simple act of thinking carefully becomes the most important form of resistance we have. Every moment presents the same choice Bonhoeffer faced. Will you surrender your mind for the comfort of certainty, or will you choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence? The answer you give doesn't just determine your own fate, it helps determine the fate of human consciousness itself.